Hey everyone, welcome to our panel on coming out at work. My name is Ashley Mudd and I am the program director for Reaching Out MBA. Our mission is to increase the influence and representation of the LGBTQ community in business. And we do that primarily through working with LGBTQ MBAs and alumni. I'm really excited to be your host for today's panel. So to introduce the rest of the panelists, we're going to go down the row, and if you could share your name, your pre-MBA industry and geography, and how long you have been out professionally.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Aaron. I am a current MBA student at London Business School. I'm also one of the co-presidents of the Year Out Conference. Pre-MBA, I was at McKinsey & Company. I joined them in 2017, and I first came out at work when I had joined McKinsey in 2017. So I've been out for about 5 years professionally.
Hi everyone, I'm Shalini. I'm also an MBA student at LBS, like the others. Before the MBA, I worked at Bain & Company in diversity and inclusion, and I've been out in general 2 years, so been out since then.
Cool. So my name is Faris Ahmad, like my colleagues on the panel, also an MBA at London Business School. I act as Chief of Staff at the Year Out Conference. I struggle to answer this question a little bit, but I think, where I think I'm the most authentic person throughout my professional career is probably about 5 years ago would be right, but I think it's still sort of in that journey of discovering myself. But yeah, pronounced he, him.
Hey friends, my name is Aiden Appel. I'm also doing my MBA to complete the set. Prior to joining LBS, I worked at Accenture for a couple of years and then a tech startup called Alfred, both in New York. And I've been out for more than 12 years, so my entire professional career and at every company.
Thank you. Before we jump into our questions, we just want to share a short disclaimer. A lot of the stories that you're going to hear today and the advice shared come from relatively safe environments, and we acknowledge that not everyone has that same safety. So despite any of the advice that you hear today, we do encourage you to put your personal safety first and foremost. So for the next few questions, just whoever feels to speak, jump in first. How do you think about coming out at work in general? And if you could share a little bit about when you made the decision to come out at work.
Sure, I'm happy to share my own perspective here. I recommend coming out as early as you can. So in the interview, if there's a natural moment for that, or even before the interview. So, indicating something on your resume, if you're involved in any sort of community building activities, or even, joining LGBT networks professionally, which can also help kind of unlock some career opportunities.
I think another way to think about coming out too, because you'd be coming out all the time. It's not just like, oh, it's done. Is I think like who you're coming out to, when you come out, and how. And so I think who is, I think you'd love to be out with like your team, your boss, in terms of like, do you need to send an email to the whole company? Probably not, right? I think, when you come out early in the process, I think just takes the pressure off, because then it's like, oh no, are they like assuming I'm straight? Do I need to tell them? Is it going to be awkward in conversation? And then I think, I think how is just, do you just casually mention your partner or pronouns, or is it like, signaling on your resume? Is it through joining the Pride Network at your company if they have one? So those are some things to think about.
So the way I sort of see this is potentially, everyone's sort of in different parts of their career, and I think one of the things I'd like to point out is, as Charlie mentioned, it's not a binary sort of today I'm out, and that's a demarcation line. I think it's a whole journey that you're looking at, and you just have to focus more on yourself and bring it. You know when you're ready. And again, here you might be just out to one colleague at work. You might be out to just a group of people at work. Is that being out at work? And so maybe I like to turn that question to how authentic you are at work, right? It could be, am I 90% authentic today? You're hoping to reach to 100% at some point, but I think that's it's a scale that you're working with, right? You might start with a 5%, and that's okay. And that could spend 10, 20 years. I mean, we've got people who are still coming out at work, still figuring that out. I've got senior managers who are transitioning at work, very much later of their lives. So, you know, it's just to bear that in mind, that it is a journey. But again, when you're ready for that journey, seize that opportunity, I think would be my advice.
Covered it quite well.
When do you recommend not coming out at work?
Happy to take this one. One thing I'm acutely aware of, at least personally, is I come from a very privileged background. You know, I worked in an industry that was relatively liberal. I grew up in the Western world. You know, I completely recognize there are instances where it might not feel fully safe to come out at work. And I would say only come out when you feel comfortable and you feel safe and you have a support network. You know, I'm fully aware and I completely recognize there are certain industries and there are certain places in the world where it's illegal to be gay or it's legal to be queer. On top of that, you know, there might be biases in the organization as well. So I think my piece of advice is if you're not fully comfortable, if there's a doubt in your mind, don't push it. You know, you need to prioritize yourself. You need to prioritize your safety first. So that's my 2 cents. Does anyone else have any other thoughts?
I might challenge. I mean, just give a healthy challenge to that, which would be that, you know, there's a lot of research out there that shows that people who are out in the workplace perform better, they stay longer. So, you know, there's benefits to both yourself and the company for expressing who you are. So I would say, you know, if there's a time where, you know, you're not coming out and that's really bothering you at work and you would like to come out, I would say it is an opportunity to kind of push yourself. And especially with work, you know, there's also research out there that, you know, earlier is better. So people who, if they don't come out within their first year at a job, are far more likely to never come out at that job. So, you know, if you are starting a new job, if you're going to your first job or you're transitioning jobs, you know, right when you start is an opportunity to kind of reset and define yourself. And so it could be an opportunity to kind of push past that boundary. Again, if you think that you will get, you know, some more comfortable, you will become more comfortable and gain the rewards of that.
Yeah, and kind of picking up on that, I think there's also things you can look for, like at a company for those support networks, like you were saying, right? So if your company has some kind of like Pride or employee resource group, right? If there are active conversations around diversity and inclusion, like those could be opportunities. And again, like you don't have to come out to everyone completely. So a lot of companies, like I know we had it at Bain, like there was an opportunity to be out just among the LGBTQ population only, but not necessarily to like the wider company, or like there's kind of gradients or levels. And so it's not like, oh my gosh, now everyone knows. But, you know, there are ways that I think a lot of organizations, especially as they're talking more about this, are trying to make it easier for those reasons, because it does help kind of your professional well-being too.
Yeah, just to add on that, really, to be honest, there's 2 things. One, Aidan mentioned earlier about, you know, coming out at interviews. But I think, you know, we are living in, and this is in the context of the Western world, of course, you know, personal safety in other parts of the world, notwithstanding that. Do your due diligence, right? Like you can ask a lot of questions around, do you have an ERG? Do you have, and this is not only relevant to the LGBTQIA+ space. You want to ask them about gender representation. You want to ask them about ethnic minorities. You want to ask them different questions, challenge them. Far often, you know, I've spoken to, you know, recruiters, etc., where I've asked them that question and they come back and go, well, I don't really know. And that sort of goes to show whether, you know, how much of that culture is sort of represented in the recruitment process, etc. So that's number 1. Number 2, I would say finding an ally. So you might find yourself in a role where, you know, the environment is not as conducive, or in industries where you might, you know, it is probably less friendly. Find an ally that, you know, far more often you will find one person that's close to you, right? And it might not be a network, it might not be a formal network, but that's your first step in trying to be authentic self at work.
I think about my first job after college and how difficult it was for me to navigate coming out and to know when, where, and how to do that. So it might be helpful if you share your personal stories. Could you share broadly about your personal experiences coming out professionally?
Yeah, I can talk about, so I guess most recently, my summer internship between the 2 years of the MBA, I was like, look, I don't want this hanging over my head or anything else. And so kind of just early on, like in a team meeting, like drop my partner's pronouns, just mention like we're going on a trip or going somewhere. So I think for me, that was just among my teams. It was like kind of 5 or 6 people. And, you know, if it came up in conversation with other people or other, you know, that I was working with over the summer, you know, fine. But I think that was important to me to just like get it out there. Okay, good, move on. We can kind of focus on the work.
So I think one of the ways in which like I've grown in my own coming out story, or yes, coming out story at work is I think, you know, when I started coming out at work, it felt like this thing where it's like, okay, I just want to get this out of the way so I can be comfortable again. And I think I've started seeing that a little bit differently, where it's actually, this is something that can really be an asset to me. So, you know, like during the recruitment process at my MBA, you know, I've met multiple companies because I chose to self-identify as LGBT and be involved with, you know, the LGBT work at LBS. You know, companies looking to hire LGBT talent were able to find me, right? And so this is actually something that, you know, now it's not just off my shoulders, but it's something I can actually use, you know, to kind of find the jobs that I want.
Yeah, I completely echo what Aiden said. So for me personally, I first came out professionally when I had applied to McKinsey. They had this checkbox that you could tick in the application process where you can self-disclose your sexuality and say whether or not you identify with the queer community. I had checked that box. And a couple of weeks later, somebody from GLAM, which is Gay Lesbian McKinsey, had reached out to me saying, hey, we know you're interviewing, would love to offer resources and support in case you want to chat about the firm or if you want some help with case interviews and stuff like that. And it's because of proactive outreach from the company that I was open to coming out at the firm. I felt comfortable enough when I was finally hired to actually come out and be my authentic self. So I feel very privileged and very lucky that that's the case. And I think that, you know, I think a lot of companies do that now. And I think if companies don't do that, that's something they definitely should be doing because it really helps people at the end of the day. It squashes any doubt in their minds of whether or not they will be accepted in the workplace because of their sexuality.
So just a little bit more, you know, there are various creative ways that companies tend to do this. One, like Shalini mentioned at Bain, they have different sort of tiers, etc. One of the companies I worked at had, you know, an ERG group, and they had badges that said Pride or Allies. And, you know, there's no pressure to have them, but I think because a lot of allies also took their badges, and everyone had a rainbow badge in their ID card. So that's one way of like coming out. You know, you could have a pride badge, and you maybe that sparks a conversation. So you might not necessarily start a conversation, but that sparks a conversation. And I don't think that's a right or wrong, right? In that it might actually backfire that you have, you know, a little bit of a pride label on you going around, but that's one way of doing it. In other organizations, as Aaron mentioned, I had a tick box, and another organization I was in college, and so I think it goes back to my point earlier on that due diligence that you before or in the process of getting a job is quite important. I think far more important today than it has ever been.
I'd love to know how your perspective has changed on coming out and work. And before I hand it over to you, I'll share. In my first job after college, I was outed by a coworker. It was not a job where I was comfortable being out. And it's interesting how in that role, it worked out okay. She still shouldn't have done it, but it worked out fine. But it went from this moment of really being terrified. I hadn't heard that research that if you don't come out in your first year, you tend to not come out. And I hadn't, and I would have been totally fine sort of staying in the closet in that job. It just felt easier. And so when my coworker outed me, I was sort of waiting for this shoe to drop and all of this drama to happen. And it didn't, but it made me that much more empowered in my next job to come out in the beginning, to find an opportunity where if someone was going to use sort of the pronouns of my partner, to correct them in that moment and to do it often and quickly so that I didn't sort of have this thing hanging over me to sort of wait because someone else was eventually going to know and sort of out me. So how has your experience on coming out changed over your career?
I'd say it's become more organic, right? So I think as you go through the years, you know, it becomes less at the forefront of things and becomes more organic. So I would say at the beginning of my career, it probably was at the forefront quite more. But I think as I progress in my career, it's sort of, you know, in conversations, it comes up quite rightly. And again, you know, the place is, you know, the world's at a different place today than it was, say, 10 years ago. So we are moving towards that hopefully an ideal equilibrium where we don't have to make this as a big deal, where everyone sort of accepts it as it is. But of course, you know, a lot of work still to be done. So I would say it's a bit more organic over the years. But again, that's my personal experience.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, what I realized after coming out at work finally was that a lot of the fears I had previously about coming out at work, the apprehensions I had about not being accepted or being judged or being looked at differently, really didn't materialize, at least not that I noticed. You know, there was a lot of negative talk in my head. There was a lot of fears in my head. And what I had realized when I finally came out was, you know, people are okay with it. You know, most people, 99% of people were fine with it. And it was just so nice having that weight lifted off my shoulder. And I almost kind of wish that I had done it sooner. So that was a big relief for me.
I'll add just, I mentioned kind of earlier how it was maybe something to get off versus now it's kind of an asset. I guess the other change, kind of similar to what Ferris mentioned, was like it has become a lot more organic. And I think the more you come out, the easier it gets every single time. So, you know, look for places where you can kind of come out. If you are earlier in the journey, you know, try to look for like low stakes situations where you can come out, and hopefully that can kind of help snowball, you know, into being comfortable coming out, you know, in a work setting.
And kind of just building off your point too, Aiden, just thinking about like ways, right? Like Ferris, you mentioned like pride badges or stickers. I think email signatures are like a really great and easy way. Like put your pronouns, you know, if there's something that your company has, like a specific, like pride specific signature. I think especially a lot of larger companies have kind of ways to just show that designation if it's your name badge or your email signature. And I think that sometimes just makes it a little bit easier, maybe a little bit less likely that they're going to assume your partner's pronouns or something like that.
It's a really good segue into our next question. What can managers and organizations do to support coming out in the workplace?
A lot. I think we've talked about at least some examples, but I mean, there's kind of these signaling, you know, opportunities like we've talked about, but I think there's all the way up to like broader cultural elements, and there's role modeling and hiring people and making an effort, kind of reaching out to LGBTQ candidates, showing up to events like this and the recruitment. I mean, yeah, we could spend the whole panel talking about what companies could do, but I think a lot of it is around kind of the day-to-day interactions, making sure people feel comfortable being themselves, using words like partner, just normalizing things like partner, significant other, or more kind of gender neutral, just terms for, you know, for like a relationship. Those are just a couple examples, but I'm sure y'all have others.
I think one of the things I'd add to that is probably the allyship part of it, right? You might have a manager who is LGBTQIA+ or not. I think that power of allyship, find that power of allyship in any organization. And that could be allyship for other areas. So for example, the women's network or the Black network or the ethnic minority network, whatever it might be. That amplifies your purpose, because everyone in these networks have got some sort of agenda that they're trying to move forward. And I think, you know, working collectively and having, you know, management acknowledge the existence and putting their money where the mouth is, you know, and that's essentially quite important. So a lot, as Shalini mentioned, that management can play their role in it.
I think that's a great point. I'd love to add that I think when you find yourself in the, you know, as a manager, I would recommend that you kind of are in touch at least with every single ERG across the company. You know, even if, let's say, you primarily identify with, let's say, like the ex-military ERG, right? Try to make sure that you've met and have at least a contact at every single ERG around the company, so you can support, you know, not just the LGBT employees, but kind of all different types of identities across the office. And I think kind of doing something like that will help establish you as a, you know, general ally. And I think that's just a great signal to the people working for you that you are making an effort to understand a variety of different experiences and, you know, to be there and support them.
I appreciate Aiden's point of sort of when you are in a management role. And I think too that when we come out, we make space for other people to come out. at work. I think of roles that I've been in before where I was the first out person, but I definitely was the first queer person. And so I think sort of when we're out and if we're willing to come out earlier in our career, it paves ways for other people to do that. And just one thing I'll add about organizations, Aaron said, I think it was when you were applying for McKinsey, you were able to sort of identify, I think giving your team an opportunity to identify in a way that they want to, using the words that matter to them, I think is a huge step. I know it's something that we struggle with organizationally, where we sort of keep metrics and data of who we're serving, and our words are literally changing every year. I think it's important. It doesn't matter how hard it is to make sure that we're sort of updating our language so that people have the words to self-identify in the way that matters the most to them. What can you do if you perceive unwelcomeness based on your LGBT identity in the workplace?
That's a tricky one. I would recommend finding a safe space. And I think most people have someone in the organization they feel safe confiding in, whether that's a colleague, a peer, a mentor, maybe your manager. So I would probably start there, right? I would go to them and say, hey, this is a situation. Here's how I'm feeling. You know, what are your thoughts? Could you support me? Do you have any advice? Because I completely recognize it's difficult being in an organization, you know, where there are different relationships and different things at play. So I would definitely recommend trying to establish a safe space first, you know, grounding yourself and then working from there.
I think the other part that you could play, again, you know, depending on where you are in your career, you know, it's challenging for those who can't speak as well. So one of the things that you should be looking at it, you know, we all have powers in different ways. You know, it might be a colleague that's just come out and you're far down the process, etc. Looking at them and being aware of things happening and stepping up to challenge when things, and this applies, you know, across the board on various different metrics, right? And as you progress in your career, as you take further leading roles, you probably want to do that more, and being just aware that these things can happen, and you know, and reading the room would be something I'd add to that.
I think kind of building off a little bit of what you said too, Aaron, is like there's degrees of, you know, something that either like might make you uncomfortable in the workplace. And I think definitely step one is almost even before finding the safe space, which is like trust your intuition and believe yourself. Because I think so many times I've talked to people where they're like, oh, someone made this comment or this was a little bit off, but like maybe I'm overreacting, maybe I'm reading into it. And I think like for so many of like for people or colleagues I've had that experience, like just me saying like, no, I believe you, talk to a manager, talk to someone that you trust, like is just a little help they needed to then be like, okay, yeah, I'm glad I raised it. Like other people in the room felt the same way. Like now we've addressed it, have talked about it, you know, whatever the situation is. And so I think that first step is almost like believe yourself, and then kind of find people who you think you can support you and kind of help you figure out how to navigate it, since kind of every situation might call for a different solution.
And just one thing I'll add, I think it was Aiden saying sort of during the process of when you're looking at companies, sort of sussing out their sense of belonging and how welcoming they'll be. I think that it is something that you can tell some companies sort of before you join, and that I am hopeful that we're in a world where it's a lot easier to find companies that'll be welcoming sort of upfront, and you can make those decisions going in, asking difficult questions about who works for that company and sort of what sense of belonging are they going to provide to you.
And one thing I want to kind of add to what you said, Ashley, is in terms of sussing out, you don't have to be like, oh, like I'm queer or whatnot. But I'm not saying you're saying that. But I think there's also ways to just say like, oh, what employee resource groups do you have? They might be like, oh, we have a women's network, or we have, you know, they might mention we have a pride network. And I think that's like a way to just get a sense of if they're like, we don't have any employee support groups, or, you know, we've got diversity across the whole range. Like we don't have any problems, like, you know, red flag, maybe, right? If they say something like that. So I think there are ways that you can, without kind of sharing, that you can kind of start to understand their level of inclusion or where they are on their journey.
How do you harness your queerness to accelerate your career?
Love this question.
We talked about it.
Sure. Yeah. well, so, I mean, I think I alluded to this earlier, but especially being out in an MBA program has really been helpful with recruiting. I recruited with multiple companies like through LGBT networks, and ultimately, signed with Bain. By raising a hand, right, and saying like, this is who I am, and this is what matters to me. They were able to, similar to Aaron, right? They reached out to me, multiple times through different people in their Be Glad network. Hoping to have coffee chats and develop the relationship. And I think, I obviously, interviewing with a company, you don't just get the job because you raise your hand and self-identify. Like, it's a rigorous process, but I would guess that it had a greater than zero impact on my candidacy.
And I think kind of similar, it's not just in the recruiting process. I think it's the network, right? I think for me, I was able to meet a lot more people at, my company through the LGBTQ network, people I might not have crossed paths with, and kind of had a chance to connect across departments, across levels of seniority, and kind of exposure that I think I might not have had otherwise, but had through the Pride network.
One other thing that I want to add on is the feeling of otherness that you get because you're queer. I know that for me growing up, I always felt a bit different and a little bit off, and I didn't quite fit in, and I felt, just out of place. And as a result of that, I'm a lot more, at least I like to think, I'm a lot more in tune with my emotions and emotions of other people, and more empathetic. And I think that skill set, because of the otherness I've experienced, allows me to harness and develop greater relationships with people. And it makes me also more aware when I'm in a room of how am I perceived, how are other people perceived, what are the dynamics in the room. So I think because I was queer and because I felt excluded and othered, I am, as a result, more empathetic. And that is a massive asset in the professional world when you're constantly working with other people. You're never operating in a world where you're alone. You're always working with other people. So if you can tap into that empathy and those relationship skills, I think that can get you really, really far professionally.
Just to round it off, I think, the seats at the table, claim that seat on the table, because you are going to use your queerness, and that seat's for you. And if you don't claim it, someone else who's probably far more useless is going to claim that seat, and it is, and that's not helpful for anyone. So I think make sure rise up, claim that seat, and make use of that seat, because you're bringing yourself to that table.
Thank you for that.
Exactly, that's why we're on these seats.
Literal seats. Now we'd love to open up to the audience for any questions that you might have for the panelists.
Yasha.
Thanks for this and for sharing all your stories with us. I was thinking, we've been discussing on what can be done more like on an organizational or firm level. And I was considering more into a personal, like one-to-one from your colleagues. Is there anything in particular you have appreciated, like this particular moment? Like, it was really good for me to know that this was my self or my safe space, or that I know I can go to that person. And mostly because we also want to know, like, what else can we be do in a one-to-one? So I will really appreciate having some of these stories.
So I've got one story. This happened about, a year into my first job 10 years ago, shows my age. But in essence, I had this one senior person at my firm. He's just joined from, I think, one of the big banks. So very much, different culture, etc. But one thing that opened my mind when he first met me, and not just me, everyone, he would ask, in a social setting, oh, so have you got a girlfriend or boyfriend? And that was quite eye-opening 10 years ago to come across someone like that who's just suddenly gone. You don't expect that. The normal societies is, I'm a male cisgendered person, and they go, well, have you got a girlfriend? And yeah, you're in that situation where you're like, you don't even have that opportunity to say that actually I don't, or you just say, well, I don't, and then you stop there, right? Whereas this person is given the extra space. So it's just one of those things where I remember, far long ago in my career where someone did that, and I think it stuck to me until today. And so that's one thing where you don't, it starts, if someone sees that, right, someone else, an ally sees that, that's something that they can emulate and sort of, make sure that they're consciously thinking about things as opposed to just assuming things.
I think also just creating like norms around inclusion, and I don't think it's sort of necessarily unique to LGBTQ, but having a conversation of, like, let's say you're on a team or you're leading a team, and it's okay, what are our team norms? What's important to us as a team? What do we value? How do we want to create a good environment? And I think just having that like open conversation already creates a space for, if you do have an issue down the line or something uncomfortable does happen, like your team's got your back. And I think that is welcoming for like all, and just good leadership, quite frankly.
I'd recommend 2 tactical things. So one is just really try to get to know everybody on your team at a personal level, even if it's 15 minutes for a coffee. Create the space for them. And second would be, I think I touched on this earlier, but like go to every single like company ERG event like once, right? Make sure that you know someone there that you can refer people to, and take the time to kind of consider a perspective or experience outside of your own.
Can I ask a question? Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all your stories. I think a few of you have mentioned that you've really been able to use at least that checkbox as an asset to not only kind of like claim that seat on the table, but also, feel the comfort to be your authentic self from day one. I've met a few people along my life who have tried to take advantage of that checkbox, and they have almost jokingly said, haha, I am LGBTQ for the sake of. And how do you kind of recommend responding to those people who do that? Because that's happened, I mean, not once, not twice, a few times in my life. And I know what I have to say, but I want to be better and more thoughtful. And I'm just wondering if you guys have any advice, any suggestion around that.
Yeah, I mean, that's really dangerous to do. It's like lying about where you went to college, right? You can't just say you went to Harvard. It'll have to check out at some point, and that will get cross-referenced. And there are stories out there of people who falsify credentials. I mean, it's not necessarily a credential, but who falsify attributes about themselves, and their careers get destroyed for that. So forgetting right and wrong, like level of self-interest, don't do that.
Yeah, and I think you just have to call it out if you see something like that, because that person falsely identifying as X group therefore undermines everybody else who should be rightfully taking that role or who does fall into that diversity group. So I think if you do see it happening, the most helpful thing that can be done is calling it out as it is and saying, hey, that's not cool. You're taking away from people who actually fall into this group and who truly are disadvantaged, right? And you're hurting everyone, and that's very selfish of you. So.
And I think the rest of it, you leave it to karma as well. It does come back to bite you. So
what goes around comes around.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking today. It was really interesting to hear all your stories. I just had one question regarding, I've been in situations before where I entered a space as the only first queer person in sometimes the entire city. And I was just wondering, I've had experiences where then people then came to me and said, okay, well, I want you to answer all of my questions about the LGBTQ. And I was like, I can tell you about my own personal experiences, but I can't speak for everybody. How do you kind of deal with that in a professional setting? Like, have people come up to you and expected you to know everything about LGBTQ people and answer all of their questions? Like, how do you kind of balance that?
Yeah, I think it comes up a lot, especially through employee resource groups, where it's like, okay, woman of color and queer, like you're going to be on every recruitment event or, asked to do all of these things, right? And it's like, when am I going to do my day job, right? And I think that is where one can say hey, you identify as an ally too, right? Inclusion's important to you. Let's talk about let me make sure that you know about our inclusion strategy, or a little bit about the company, or a little bit about our, Pride network, and so that you're able to talk about it. And I think that's one thing that I think companies who are further along in their journey are doing, right? Like, I'd be surprised, like, I'm sure that, for example, this like recruitment fair, I'm sure a lot of people, or a handful at least, are allies. And they're like, look, this is just as important to us. And we're, well briefed on what the company is doing. They're attending the Pride events, even if they're an ally, so they can speak about their own experience. And so I think kind of just trying to share the load where you can. And that means there might still be, a burden of, okay, let me tell you a little bit about it, or let me educate you on what's going on. But then when someone asks you, you can say like, oh, why don't you talk to Aaron about that? Like, he could tell you a little bit more, or, I'm more on this area, or can share about this. So I think trying to spread the love, and if you're the only, pulling allies into it.
Yeah, and I think, Sean, this has happened to me quite a lot as well. And I think, and when it first happened, it used to irritate me quite a lot. Simple things like, oh, well, how are you going to have children? Or simple things like that. I think take a step back and also understand from a place of curiosity. They are trying to educate themselves, and they're trying. I mean, you've got people who are probably just malice, or some people who are genuinely curious. So I think take that back to understand where they're from. But I think going from Charles' point, and then you sort of signpost them, and always go back to you. And there's nothing wrong to say, well, I don't know about everyone else, but this is how my experience has been. Because I mean, talking about anything, you're not going to be able to talk for everyone else. So I think caveating with that is absolutely perfectly fine to do, and people should understand, and signposting them to other resources if you have that resources to signpost them. Otherwise, it's also perfectly fine to say you don't know.
Just one thing I'll add to that. I don't think it helps sort of you in this situation now, but one day, hopefully all of you will be in a position of influence or decision maker in a company. I think too, that when you're going to people and asking them to share their story, that you compensate them for sharing that lived experience, to the point that you made sort of like be in this ERG and this one and represent the company. I think that once someone sees you are comfortable sharing your story, you tend to be the one that people come to over and over again to sort of be the face of this. And so when you are in a position of influence and you have a say over that process, to make sure people are being compensated for that, because it's usually on top of the day job that they're expected to do. And I think it's often an oversight. And I've worked with some companies where it's almost viewed as they're doing you a favor by allowing you to share your story. But there's a lot of mental labor that goes into that. Even if you're in a good place with your identity, there's still mental labor that goes into that. So when you do have the opportunity to do that, just make sure you're compensating people for what they are sharing.
Thank you. Since being out at work, do you ever experience any microaggressions regarding your gender or sexual identity? And also, how would you advise to kind of respond to that in a professional setting, especially if it's somebody who has a lot of influence on your position, like for example, a supervisor or somebody in an even higher role?
I think for me, the most common one is folks assuming the gender of my partner, saying, hey, are you dating any women? Are you dating any girls? And what I'll usually do is jump in and say, hey, no, I don't have a boyfriend, I'm gay. So I think that's probably the most common one I've experienced. I don't know, what have you all experienced?
No, not much. I mean, I think partly, coming out early can help with that. But if you do make that, I recommend a really quick correction, from a place of love and understanding. I don't recommend the kind of swinging with the bat. But try to do that, and then even vice versa, right? I think if you mess up, just have a quick apology and move on. I think these are someone from Year Out mentioned this analogy, but it's at the level of a pinprick, right? So if you happen to be pinpricked, just let the person know, oh, that's you just correct it. And if you happen to pinprick somebody else, just apologize and move on.
Yeah, and I think I want to especially emphasize, Aiden, what you said is the quick correction, because I think the longer it goes on, it's in your mind, and then you're it's been a week, it's been 2 weeks, now it's way too awkward for you to even mention this, or now they've done it again, and then they'll be well, why didn't you do it the first time, right? And I think I think the speed is important if you're comfortable, and it's like, hey, look, I'm sure this wasn't your intent, but and I think kind of trying to assume best intention, because I think in a lot, and I hope that folks are in workplaces where generally the culture is broadly inclusive. And I think most of the time people are well-meaning, they just either haven't had that experience or don't necessarily they're used to using a certain set of language about partners, or that's been their experience. And so I think just remembering, look, they probably didn't mean it, and so let me just have that quick, gentle correction, and that might save other, queer people or non-binary or whatever it might be, like save them from that pinprick, in the future.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks, Sher. So thanks everybody for your time as well. But I just was kind of interested to know if you have any advice on kind of seeking mentorship or friendship within employee resource groups, or generally just within the LGBTQ community, in the workplace. And if you have any specific advice for that, I really appreciate it.
I think just getting involved. So a lot of times if you have, a Pride or network of some sort, LGBTQ network, there's always, of course, going to be months, in Pride Month or around kind of Pride events, bring in speakers. And I think having been on the side of leading ERGs or being very involved in them, people are always looking for helping hands to put something together. And so I think either coming with an idea of hey, can we bring in the speaker? Or, hey, I had this idea for an event, or do you need, someone else for Pride or whatever it is. I think raising your hand, I think, gets you noticed. It helps, it could provide exposure to senior people that you might not, kind of like what Aiden was saying in terms of leveraging, your queerness, your identity as an asset. So I think just being hey, I'm here to help. How can I be involved? You'll get a chance to work with people, and then you have more people in the organization that can vouch for you or know that, you're really involved. And I think it just kind of only goes from there.
Yeah, and if let's say you're at a smaller company that doesn't necessarily have an ERG, or there are a couple group of people, there's a group of people you'd like to meet. I mean, you can also just offer to host a happy hour, do a little queer beers situation.
Yeah, I love that.
I suppose just to add a little bit that this is probably creative now. The sort of solution to it is probably reaching out. Obviously, in the days of LinkedIn, etc., you might find actually people have put themselves out there in wanting to mentor, to pay it forward. But you also probably can find some events that are happening in the city or wherever you're based, networking events or places like this where you network. So try to go beyond, in your current organization, and try to look outside from that as well, especially Aiden's point on small organizations where that might not be readily, be accessible. Yeah.
One thing I just wanted to add on the topic of mentorship, the best advice a friend gave me early in my career is that it's okay to have a mentor who has different identities than you. That sometimes, especially in the career that you might be in, there might not be someone in senior leadership who shares identities with you. And if you wait to keep finding someone there, you might miss out on a lot of opportunities. And so it's okay to sort of raise your hand and find mentors out there that are going to give you advice. Because really what it is that we want equality in the workplace. And so it's okay to ask mentors who have different identities than you, how did they get there? And what from their experience and journey can you sort of replicate in yours? So in our last 2 minutes, just do you have any last quick advice that you would offer to everyone about navigating their experience of being out at work?
I think I can start. I think at least one piece is just find community where you can. And so if it's coming to events like this, if it's going to conferences, as you're navigating a company environment, if there's other queer people, and if not, can you find them outside the company? I think just having others who are have gone through a similar journey can just help you process your own.
This might be a little controversial, I guess, but yeah. If I think 90% of the time you're gonna have a good experience coming out. If for the 10%, just be prepared for an adverse reaction, right? Or even a less than perfect reaction without internalizing it. So people sometimes when they get news that's unexpected, they react how they react, right? And then they process, and then they, behave differently, right? So where someone is on day one is not necessarily where they'll be, by week 2 or year 2. So you have time to, to do that. But I think it can be, a lot of people can kind of receive some trauma if they come out and, something negative, they get a negative response to that. So just, I'd say, be prepared for that to happen, at least once. And by being prepared for it, try not to internalize that negativity.
I think one final thought for me is to lean into your queerness. I would love for everyone here to reframe the conversation of being queer not as a disadvantage, but rather as a superpower and a strength. And, we've talked a little bit about how you can find mentors, you can, better connect with people. There's many benefits of being queer. So I would challenge every single person here to go on a journey with me in rethinking and reframing how we think about queerness. Because it's, at the end of the day, not a disadvantage. It's something that's incredibly powerful if we let it be.
Final one from me is just really bringing back full circle to what I said earlier on when we first introduced ourselves, was to bring it back to your own journey and to think about coming out as how authentic you are. And that means, if you're at 1% today or 0.5% today, if tomorrow is 1%, you're moving forward. So it's fine to stay stagnant at 5% for a while, because that's where you're comfortable with, and try to have a bit of self-care to that, rather than necessarily, it's not a race. Obviously you want to, like I said, seize the opportunity when it comes. So obviously if there is an opportunity, you don't see that's just, a missed opportunity, but make sure you're also not pushing yourself just because, you need to, or you're forced to do that.
Thank you all for joining us for this panel, and thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.